They called it the Gate of the Gods, but others whispered another name, the City of Sin. Beneath the endless stars of Mesopotamia, its towers once gleamed like fire against the night sky, a vision of power and desire born from the desert sands. How did Babylon rise to rule the ancient world, and why did the gods themselves turn away? For centuries its name has carried both wonder and warning. Babylon, a city of temples, kings, and secrets that refuse to die. Tonight, we uncover the entire history of ancient Babylon, its glory, its mysteries, and its fall. From a humble settlement between two rivers to an empire that shaped law, faith, and civilization itself, Babylon's story is one of ambition reaching toward the heavens, and of pride that brought it crashing back to earth. Every empire believes it will last forever, but Babylon's fall proved that even kings who speak to gods can drown in their own pride. Its story still haunts us, a mirror held up to humanity's oldest desire, to build eternity from clay and call it divine. So, close your eyes and drift back 4,000 years, to the banks of the Euphrates, where the wind still whispers the name, Babylon. Between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the earth breathed life into the first civilizations. The land shimmered beneath the heat of an endless sun, yet the rivers brought fertility to its soil. Here, the world's earliest cities were born, small clusters of mud huts surrounded by canals and reeds, where farmers prayed for steady floods and merchants bartered with clay tablets and grain. This was Mesopotamia, the cradle of human civilization, and within it lay a small, unremarkable settlement that would one day shake the heavens, Babylon. In the beginning, Babylon was barely a name on the map. It was a settlement of fishermen, farmers, and shepherds, rising from the marshlands like a quiet dream. The Sumerians to the south and the Akkadians to the north already ruled mighty cities, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, places whose kings built ziggurats and carved their victories into stone. Compared to them, Babylon was a whisper in the wind, a modest crossing point on the great river roads that connected the heart of Mesopotamia. Yet geography is destiny. The land between the rivers was a gift, and Babylon stood exactly where those two mighty forces of nature nearly embraced. The Euphrates curved gently to the west, carrying silt, life, and trade from distant lands. The Tigris flowed faster and rougher to the east, feeding the fields that glittered like gold under the morning light. Between them stretched a network of canals, dug by calloused hands and sustained by prayers. Babylon sat at their meeting point, a place where traders from Sumer, Akkad, and even Elam could exchange goods, stories, and gods. The first settlers did not know they were building history. They built for survival. The air smelled of wet clay and burnt reed. The walls of their homes were thin but strong. They used mud bricks, pressed by hand, left to dry under the relentless sun. Over time, the small fishing village became a trading stop, and the trading stop became a town. Travellers paused here to rest their animals and buy food before moving on toward the great cities. The people learned the languages of merchants who came from far and wide, blending words, customs, and beliefs into something new. By the late 4th millennium before Christ, Babylon had already absorbed much from its neighbours. The Sumerians brought the art of writing, cuneiform, small wedge marks pressed into clay that carried the first stories and records. The Akkadians brought the strength of empire, teaching that a single ruler could command many cities through law and divinity. Between these two great cultures, Babylon began to form its identity. The early kings of Mesopotamia often saw their rule as divine, their power flowing from the heavens. In this world, the gods were everywhere, in the water that flooded the fields, in the storms that tore the roofs apart, in the quiet dawn that followed. To live in such a place was to live close to eternity. And so, as Babylon grew, its people began to imagine their own god who would watch over them, protect them, and give their city purpose. They called him Marduk, a name that would one day stand above all others in the Babylonian pantheon. But at this time, Marduk was still young, still rising, just as his city was. Trade flourished. Merchants carried copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and timber from Lebanon. The wealth that flowed through Babylon's markets brought artisans, scribes, and priests. Temples began to rise, small at first, made of the same clay that built their homes. Each temple was a bridge between heaven and earth, where offerings were left to please the gods who controlled the floods. The priests read omens in the stars, in the livers of sacrificed animals, and in the ripples of the river's surface. Every sign was a message from above. Every message demanded obedience. As the centuries passed, neighbouring empires rose and fell. The Akkadian Empire of Sargon the Great swept across Mesopotamia, binding the cities under one banner. When that empire collapsed, chaos returned. City fought against city, and trade faltered. Yet Babylon endured. It survived because of its rivers, its location, and its adaptability. While others burned in the fires of conquest, Babylon rebuilt, learning from each empire that passed through its gates. The third dynasty of Ur brought order once again. From their southern throne, the kings ruled with strict administration, sending officials northward to manage outposts like Babylon. Though still small, Babylon benefited from this network. Its canals improved, its trade secured, its people fed. Farmers grew barley and wheat, shepherds raised sheep and goats that grazed under the distant shadow of ziggurats. The city began to prosper quietly, preparing for the day it would no longer live in the shadow of others. Then came the Amorites, tribes from the western deserts. They were wanderers, traders, and warriors. Around the year 1894 BC, an Amorite leader named Sumu-Abum took Babylon for himself. It was a quiet conquest compared to others in Mesopotamian history, but it changed everything. For the first time, Babylon was independent. It was free to write its own destiny, and destiny, it seemed, was eager to be written. The Amorites strengthened Babylon's walls and reorganized its rule. They brought with them new customs, blending their gods with Babylon's old ones. The city's language became a mix of Akkadian and Amorite, its religion a fusion of Sumerian and Western faiths. Babylon was no longer just a small river town, it was becoming a bridge between worlds. Its very name, derived from the Akkadian Babilu, meant Gate of God, and perhaps for the first time its people began to believe that their home was sacred. The canals widened, carrying boats filled with grain, wool, and pottery. The markets buzzed with voices, the air filled with the smell of fresh dates and burning incense. Every year the temples grew taller, built not just for worship but to prove that human hands could touch the heavens. The ziggurat, that great stepped tower, became the city's heart, rising like a mountain from the flat plains. It was said that from its top one could feel the breath of the gods. But even in those early days, pride and faith walked hand in hand. Babylon's people believed they stood at the centre of creation, the very gate between heaven and earth. Their rituals, their laws, and their art all reflected a singular idea that they were chosen. The city's growth became more than mere expansion. It became a declaration of divinity. And so, while other cities fought and fell, Babylon grew quietly, steadily, like a seed nourished by sacred soil. Years turned to centuries, kings rose and faded, and still Babylon stood. Its clay walls baked under the same relentless sun, but within them the hum of life never ceased. The rivers shifted their course, yet the canals endured, carrying the pulse of the city to its fields and temples. And somewhere along that long, patient road of history, Babylon transformed, from a settlement of mud and reed into a power that would one day command the world's attention. From dust and devotion, a new city rose, its name whispered like prayer and warning alike: Babylon. Babylon was alive with sound, scent, and motion. The city breathed like a living creature, its heart beating beneath the hot sun of Mesopotamia. At dawn, the first light touched the blue-glazed tiles of the Ishtar Gate, and the air trembled with the distant clang of bronze. Merchants called to one another in Akkadian, Amorite, and Sumerian, their voices rising above the low hum of animals and carts. The scent of fresh bread and burning incense drifted through narrow streets lined with mud brick walls. Everywhere, colour, gold dust on temple statues, red ochre on the market stalls, and deep indigo on woven fabrics brought from distant lands. Along the processional way, crowds gathered as priests in linen robes moved slowly toward the Temple of Marduk. Their chants rolled like waves, echoing between tall walls covered in dragons and lions, sacred beasts of the gods. People knelt as they passed, bowing their heads in reverence or fear. In Babylon, faith was not a choice, it was the rhythm of life. Every prayer, every offering, every whisper of wind carried divine weight. The markets near the river were the city's soul. Traders from every corner of the known world crowded the stalls. Persians with fine metals, Phoenicians with cedar and purple dye, Egyptians with linen and papyrus. Babylon's own craftsmen sold jewellery, bronze blades, and clay tablets filled with contracts and prayers. The air buzzed with haggling voices and laughter. Somewhere in the distance a scribe read aloud from a tablet, his words careful and rhythmic, as others copied them by the soft scratch of reeds. The whisper of papyrus and the faint clink of scales mingled with the cries of children running between baskets of dates and figs. At midday, when the sun burned white above the ziggurat, the city slowed. Workers sought shade beneath arches, priests retreated into the cool temple halls, and even the animals lay still beside the canals. Yet Babylon never truly slept. Inside the palaces, noble families met with officials, their discussions quiet but sharp. Gold coins exchanged hands, decisions made that shaped the fate of thousands. Power flowed through those marble chambers as surely as the rivers that fed the city. Babylonian society was built on layers as firm as its sun-dried bricks. At the top stood the nobles, wealthy landowners, generals and high priests who claimed favour with the gods. Their homes were large, filled with painted walls, silver vessels and servants who moved in silence. They lived close to the temples where the divine and the royal walked side by side. Their lives were guided by omens, their choices confirmed by dreams and astrologers. Below them were the merchants and craftsmen, the lifeblood of Babylon's wealth. They filled the city's workshops and markets, carving idols, weaving fabric, recording trade on clay. Many of them travelled far beyond the city walls, their caravans stretching across deserts toward the Mediterranean and beyond. Their profits filled the temples with offerings, for they believed that prosperity came only through divine blessing. Every transaction carried a prayer, every promise sealed before the gods' unseen eyes. Then came the workers, farmers, builders and soldiers, the hands that kept Babylon standing. They worked under the heat without complaint, knowing that rebellion against the order of things was rebellion against heaven itself. For the laws of Hammurabi still echoed through the generations, carved in black stone for all to see. The strong must not oppress the weak, the gods had decreed, but justice in Babylon was often weighed on uneven scales. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the slaves. Some were captives of war, others debtors who had sold their freedom for survival. They swept the temples, carried bricks, and tilled the king's fields. They owned nothing, not even their names. Yet even they prayed to Marduk, to Ishtar, to any god who might one day hear them. In Babylon, everyone lived under the watchful eyes of the divine, no matter how lowly. As the afternoon faded, the priests emerged again from the great temple. Bells rang softly and smoke rose from golden altars as incense curled into the sky. The smell was sweet and heavy, filling every breath with devotion. The people turned toward the temple, lifting their hands, whispering their petitions. In the distance, the river glowed like polished bronze, carrying boats loaded with grain and tribute toward the palace docks. Night brought its own kind of beauty. The city's lamps flickered in the dark, reflected in the calm waters of the canals. Music drifted from the courtyards, flutes, lyres, and slow drums keeping time with the heartbeat of the empire. Women wore jewels that caught the light, and men spoke in low tones of trade, omens, and the will of the gods. Above them all, the ziggurat rose like a stairway to heaven, its shadow falling across the sleeping city. Some said that from its summit, the priest could speak directly to the gods. Others whispered that the gods never answered. Every sound, every colour, every ritual carried meaning in Babylon. To live there was to live inside a story, a balance of faith and fear, power and submission. The clang of bronze in the workshops, the murmur of scribes at their tables, the fragrance of incense burning before the idols, all of it wove together into the hum of divine order. The people believed that the gods had built Babylon through human hands. Its temples stood not just as monuments, but as warnings. Every brick was a prayer, every law a reflection of heaven's command. And yet, beneath that shimmering order, doubt always lingered. Did the gods truly favour Babylon, or did they only watch, waiting for pride to rise too high once again? In the stillness of the night, when the priests extinguished the last of the temple lamps, the city seemed to breathe and listen. The wind sighed across its rooftops, stirring the palm trees and the banners above the gate. Somewhere deep within the darkness, a whisper seemed to echo through time itself, a reminder that no wall, no empire, no name endures forever. Every wall was built on faith and fear, because in Babylon, even the gods watched closely. They said every woman must serve a stranger beneath Ishtar's gaze, offering herself once in a lifetime in the temple of the goddess. They said the act was sacred, a ritual of devotion, a way to please the divine with flesh and desire. Herodotus wrote it down centuries later, his words heavy with awe and judgment, that in Babylon faith and sin were one and the same. But was it ever true? Or was it another story twisted by time, by foreign eyes that could not understand a world where the divine wore the mask of passion? The myth of temple prostitution has haunted Babylon's name for over 2,000 years. According to the tale, every Babylonian woman, no matter her rank, was bound by duty to sit once within the temple of Ishtar, waiting for a stranger to choose her, to toss a silver coin at her feet, and to speak the goddess's name. Only then, they said, was her body sanctified, her spirit cleansed, her debt to heaven paid. To outsiders, it became the ultimate symbol of decadence, of the East lost in sensuality and moral ruin. But the truth, hidden beneath the dust of centuries, tells another story, quieter, more human, and far more complex. In the oldest Babylonian text, there is no command, no law, no mention of women forced to surrender themselves in such a way. There are priestesses, yes, sacred women who served Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and war. They sang hymns, offered incense, and tended to rituals that honoured both birth and death. Some of them were called Kadeshtu, women of holiness, though later tongues would twist that word into something darker. To the Babylonians, love and creation were divine forces, neither shameful nor impure. But to the later Greeks and Hebrews, raised in cultures that feared and divided body from spirit, this openness became unthinkable. Herodotus, travelling through foreign lands, saw what he wanted to see, or perhaps what his audience expected him to. He spoke of a city where desire ruled, where even the noble bowed to lust. To him, Babylon's temples became brothels of the gods, and its rituals, evidence of corruption. His words, carried across generations, painted Babylon as a place of excess and moral decay. The Greeks saw in it a warning, the Hebrews saw in it a sin, and the world never forgot. But the rituals of Ishtar were never about indulgence. They were about life itself. The goddess was the breath of fertility, the pulse of the seasons, the storm that brings both destruction and rebirth. Her worshippers danced and sang to call the rains, to ensure the soil would yield grain and fruit. Their songs were filled with longing, yes, but longing for life, not lust. They celebrated the sacred union between heaven and earth, the eternal cycle that bound mortals to gods. Over time, those songs were lost, their meaning rewritten by conquerors who saw mystery as temptation and holiness as sin. When the Bible later spoke of the whore of Babylon, it was not merely condemning a city, it was cursing an idea, the idea that power could be beautiful, that a woman could be both divine and free. In the book of Revelation, Babylon became the mother of abominations, the symbol of pride and false glory, drunk on the blood of saints. The old city's ziggurats and temples turned into metaphors for arrogance, its queens into sinners. The spiritual Babylon of Scripture was not the real one that stood on the banks of the Euphrates, but a shadow born of fear, a city that lived only in the imagination of those who needed a villain. And so, through centuries, Babylon's name became poison and legend at once. To call a place Babylon was to call it wicked, corrupt, fallen. Artists painted it as gold and blood. Preachers spoke of it as a warning, and kings used it as a mirror to denounce their rivals. Yet the true Babylon, the city of gardens, of temples, of laws carved in stone, was long gone, buried beneath the sands. Only its echo remained, reshaped by every storyteller who came after. In truth, there were no chains in Ishtar's temple, no lines of women waiting for strangers. There were chants, offerings, music and incense. There were prayers for fertility, for peace, for safe childbirth, and for love that endured beyond the grave. Those who served the goddess did so with reverence, not shame. But when outsiders saw statues of women with uncovered heads, When they heard songs of desire and watched dances that spoke of union, they imagined sin. And from imagination was born a myth that the world would never unlearn. Herodotus gave it life, but the Bible gave it eternity. The fusion of Greek curiosity and Hebrew prophecy sealed Babylon's fate. The city that once called itself the Gate of the Gods was turned into the Gate of Sin. The goddess of creation was recast as a symbol of corruption. The sacred became profane, and the human need to worship beauty became a warning against pride. Even today, the word Babylon carries weight, spoken in sermons, songs, and stories. It means temptation, empire, arrogance, ruin. Yet beneath all the moral smoke, something true still glimmers, that humanity has always struggled with its own power, its own desire, its own longing to be close to the divine. Babylon's myth endures because it is our mirror, showing how easily reverence turns into judgment, how quickly beauty becomes guilt. They said every woman must serve a stranger beneath Ishtar's gaze, but the truth was murkier, a myth born from misunderstanding and from the world's need to call power sinful. Babylon's sins were written not by its people, but by those who feared what they could not understand, and so its reputation lived on, far beyond its fall, a legend of sacred desire, forever caught between holiness and blame. Empires rarely fall in a single night. They fade like embers, burning quietly before the dark. After Hammurabi's death, Babylon still stood proud beneath its gods, its ziggurat gleaming against the sun, its laws carved in stone. But the strength that had built an empire began to crumble from within. His heirs inherited the crown, but not his vision. The order that Hammurabi forged with justice and faith began to rot beneath the weight of ambition and greed. The great machine of empire, its canals, its armies, its temples, slowed, then faltered. The kings that followed ruled from gilded thrones, yet their reach grew shorter with every year. The rivers that once fed Babylon now carried the ashes of her kings. The wealth that once filled her granaries vanished into the hands of rebels and foreign invaders. In the south, the cities of Uruk, Lhasa, and Eridu rose in defiance. They had grown weary of Babylon's taxes, weary of her claims of divine right. Revolt spread like cracks in old stone, each one weakening the heart of the empire. The fields dried, the canals clogged with silt, and the harvest failed. The very earth that had made Babylon strong now turned against her. Then came the waves, one after another, washing over the dying city like a tide of destiny. From the mountains to the east came the Elamites, fierce and silent, burning and plundering as they descended upon the plains. They struck without warning, their banners glinting beneath the sun, their warriors flooding through Babylon's open gates. Temples were looted, statues shattered, and the gods themselves seemed to abandon their shrines. The people whispered that Marduk had turned his face away. When the Elamites withdrew, they left behind only ruin. But Babylon's fall was far from over. From the north, the Hittites appeared, a storm of iron and fire. Their invasion was swift and merciless, a flash of violence that left the city trembling. They tore through the gates, seized the treasures of the palace, and slaughtered the last king of the old dynasty. And then, as suddenly as they had come, they vanished, retreating into the highlands with their spoils. The empire was dead, its crown shattered, its spirit broken. In the silence that followed, Babylon lay bare, wounded and leaderless. But from that silence rose new rulers, the Kassites, mountain tribes who had long watched from afar. They did not come to destroy, they came to claim what remained. Step by step they entered the empty palaces and restored the broken altars. They took the name of Babylon for themselves, adopting its gods, its language, and its traditions. The city, though conquered, still cast its spell upon those who walked its streets. Even the victors became its servants, bowing before the same idols they had once mocked. For centuries the Kassites ruled, not as invaders, but as heirs to a fading dream. They rebuilt what they could, restoring the temples and reviving trade. Under their hands, Babylon breathed again, yet it was not the same. The city that once ruled the world now served as a memory of greatness. The Kassite kings sent letters to Egypt and the Hittites, calling themselves brothers of the pharaohs, but their power was built on sand. Assyria rose in the north, strong and patient, watching like a hawk waiting for the moment to strike. When that moment came, it was swift and merciless. The Assyrian armies swept southward, their chariots shaking the ground, their soldiers carrying the standards of Ashur. They conquered Babylon not once, but many times, each invasion a new wound that never fully healed. The city became both prize and prisoner, rebuilt, destroyed, and rebuilt again. The kings of Assyria claimed to love Babylon, yet each saw in it a rival, a threat, a reflection of their own pride, and so they ruled it with one hand and strangled it with the other. As centuries passed, Babylon's walls were rebuilt in stone and devotion, but its spirit dimmed. The great ziggurat still touched the sky, but the priests who climbed its steps prayed to gods who no longer answered. The canals that once shimmered with trade now carried only silt and sorrow. The songs of praise that once filled the city's air turned into laments whispered beneath the stars. Yet Babylon refused to die. Empires rose and fell around her, Kassites, Assyrians, Hittites, Chaldeans, each carving their mark into her heart. And still, her ruins glowed at sunset like embers refusing to fade. The people who walked her streets spoke new tongues, worshipped new gods, but somewhere in the dust the name of Marduk still lingered. They believed that as long as his temple stood, Babylon could not truly fall. But the gods had grown silent, and silence is the cruelest of betrayals. The same divine hands that once blessed Babylon now seemed to devour her from within. Floods destroyed the crops, plagues swept through the streets, and kings turned against their own priests. Faith became fear, and fear became despair. Babylon was no longer the gate of heaven, it was a warning carved into the earth. In time, the Assyrians came again, led by kings who believed they could erase the city forever. They razed its temples, scattered its idols, and flooded its streets. They declared the name of Babylon cursed. Yet even then, the city endured, not as walls or stones, but as legend. For how do you kill a city that was built upon belief itself? The rivers that once fed Babylon now carried the ashes of her kings. The temples that once echoed with prayer now lay broken, their altars cold. The gods who had raised her high now seemed to feast upon her fall. The empire of Hammurabi was gone, consumed by the very divine power it had once claimed to serve. And in the fading light of her last sunset, Babylon stood one final time, proud, scarred, and silent, as the dust of centuries began to settle upon her name. Nebuchadnezzar II, a name that still echoes through the corridors of history. He was both builder and destroyer, visionary and tyrant, a man who dreamed of eternity yet sowed the seeds of ruin. Under his rule, Babylon rose again from the dust, reborn in splendor so great that even the gods might have looked down in envy. The city became a jewel upon the earth, its walls gleaming in the sun, its towers piercing the clouds, its temples heavy with gold and incense. To walk through Babylon in the age of Nebuchadnezzar was to walk through a vision, a dream carved from brick and devotion. He built heaven on earth for his queen and condemned Jerusalem to dust. The two acts, creation and destruction, defined his reign. To his people he was Marduk's chosen, a king of divine purpose. To those he conquered, he was the wrath of the gods themselves. His armies swept across the Levant, crushing rebellion, toppling kings, and carrying thousands into exile. When he destroyed the Temple of Solomon, Jerusalem fell silent under fire and grief, its sacred walls reduced to rubble beneath his command. And yet, even as he waged war, Nebuchadnezzar built with the same feverish devotion. For every city he destroyed, another rose within his empire, grander, richer, eternal. At the heart of his dream stood Babylon, remade into a paradise of order and beauty. The Ishtar Gate, faced with deep blue glazed bricks, shimmered like starlight in the day's glow. Across its surface ran rows of golden lions, bulls and dragons, the symbols of Ishtar and Marduk, frozen in eternal procession. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, paved in stone and lined with reliefs of roaring beasts. Here, during the New Year festival, priests, soldiers and citizens marched toward the temple of Marduk, bearing offerings and songs that filled the air like thunder. The city pulsed with sacred life, every street a reflection of divine design. And then there were the hanging gardens, the wonder that defied both nature and imagination. Built, it is said, for his queen, Amytis of Media, who longed for the cool green mountains of her homeland. Nebuchadnezzar, unwilling to see sorrow on her face, commanded a garden to rise from the barren plains. Terraces of stone climbed high into the air, overflowing with trees, flowers, and vines. Water cascaded down hidden channels drawn up from the river by ingenious machines. From the city's streets, it seemed as though a mountain of life had grown from the desert itself. The scent of jasmine, myrrh, and cedar filled the air, mingling with the fragrance of sacrifice from the temples. Babylon, once called the Gate of God, now looked like paradise itself. But paradise carries a price. Beneath its beauty, the weight of pride began to stir. Nebuchadnezzar's devotion to Marduk was genuine, yet it was tangled with vanity. He saw himself not only as the servant of the divine, but as its reflection. The ziggurat of Babylon, the great Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, became the symbol of this ambition. Rising nearly 90 meters high, it was said to touch the sky. From its summit, priests watched the stars and read the will of the gods, while the king himself performed sacred rites to renew his right to rule. Some said that from its heights, Nebuchadnezzar looked down upon the world and believed himself chosen above all men. Others whispered that he saw his reflection in the heavens and mistook it for divinity. Still, Babylon thrived. Its walls stretched for miles, encircled by moats and towers so thick that chariots could race across their tops. Within them, palaces glittered with lapis lazuli and gold. Courtyards echoed with music, laughter, and the murmur of prayers. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and tribute flowed like a river through its gates. Scholars, astronomers, and scribes recorded the movements of planets and the patterns of dreams. For a time, it seemed that Babylon had reached perfection, that the vision of heaven on earth was complete. Yet in the stillness behind the glory, a shadow began to move. Nebuchadnezzar's power, so absolute, began to consume him. Pride turned inward, and the king who had raised temples to the gods began to see himself as one. The old stories tell that he walked among his palaces and said, "Is this not great Babylon that I have built by my mighty power, for the glory of my majesty?" And with those words, the gods withdrew their favour. Madness took him, a darkness of the mind that drove him from his throne. For 7 years, they say, he lived like a beast, wandering the fields, eating grass, his crown lost to the dust. Whether legend or truth, the tale became Babylon's warning, that even the highest king must bow before the gods or fall beneath their gaze. When his sanity returned, Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the same. The fire in his heart had dimmed, the certainty in his eyes replaced by something heavier, understanding perhaps, or regret. He ruled for many more years, strengthening Babylon's power, but the signs of decline were already there. The empire he built was vast but fragile, bound by his will alone. When his reign ended, the foundations began to tremble. Nebuchadnezzar's dream had become Babylon's destiny, magnificent, impossible, doomed. The city glowed like gold in the sun, but its brilliance carried a whisper of sorrow, as though it knew the gods were watching, waiting. He built heaven on earth for his queen and condemned Jerusalem to dust. His glory was unmatched, and yet so was his arrogance. Babylon stood at the height of its power, beautiful, defiant, and already burning with the slow fire of its own pride. The end did not come with thunder or fire, but with silence. Babylon, once the heart of an empire and the jewel of the world, fell not to destruction but to deception. In the year 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia turned his gaze toward the city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years. His armies had swept across the east, devouring kingdoms with precision and patience. Now only Babylon remained, proud, ancient, and unsuspecting. Inside its towering walls, the people still believed they were untouchable. Their gates were massive, their moats deep, and their gods eternal, but no wall, no matter how high, can keep out the quiet hand of betrayal. By that time, Babylon's strength had already faded. The once mighty empire of Nebuchadnezzar had decayed into mistrust and exhaustion. Its king, Nabonidus, had abandoned the city years before, wandering in the deserts of Arabia while his son Belshazzar ruled in his stead. The priests were restless, their loyalty divided between the old gods and the strange new beliefs of their absent ruler. The merchants whispered of shortages, the soldiers spoke of unpaid wages, and the people looked to the temples for signs that the gods still listened. Yet the heavens were silent, and the river that had long nourished Babylon began to feel like the slow pulse of a dying heart. Cyrus did not storm the walls. He did not need to. His spies and sympathizers were already inside, men who had grown tired of weak kings and forgotten prayers. One night, as the city slept, the Persians began their quiet work. Upstream, engineers diverted the Euphrates River into a canal, lowering the water level that flowed beneath the city's gates. The guards upon the walls heard nothing but the soft rush of the current and the whisper of wind through palm leaves. No horns sounded, no torches flared. In the darkness the river fell away and the dry earth appeared, a path where once there was only water. Through this hidden gate the soldiers of Persia walked. Step by step they entered the city that believed itself eternal. The people of Babylon slept as the invaders moved through the streets, their armour catching the faint glow of the moon. The temples stood undisturbed, the markets silent, the air heavy with stillness. When dawn broke, the gates of Babylon were open and Cyrus was king. There had been no siege, no fire, no fury, just silence, the kind that marks the end of a civilization. When the news spread, some wept, but others rejoiced. The priests of Marduk welcomed Cyrus as a liberator, calling him chosen by the gods. He bowed before their idols, offered sacrifices, and declared that the temples of Babylon would be restored. The people, weary of war and neglect, accepted him without resistance. The old banners were lowered, replaced by Persian standards that shimmered in the morning light. Babylon, which had once conquered the world, now belonged to another empire, one that had conquered it without lifting a sword. The river returned to its bed days later, but it no longer carried the songs of Babylon's glory. It flowed beneath empty gates, beneath walls that now belonged to strangers. The city that had been the centre of heaven and earth had fallen with barely a whisper. There were no cries of victory, no pyres of the dead, no smoke rising into the sky. Only the quiet shuffle of soldiers, the echo of footsteps in the halls of kings long gone. The last torchlight flickered against the walls, illuminating faded carvings of Marduk and Ishtar, gods who had once ruled the destiny of men and now stood powerless before time. Cyrus treated the city with mercy. He spared its people, honoured its gods, and restored its temples. Yet mercy can wound more deeply than violence. Babylon's pride, its spirit of divinity and defiance, was gone. The priests who once spoke the words of the gods now served foreign masters. The festivals of Marduk continued, but the songs had changed. The voice of Babylon was now an echo in another man's tongue. For a while, life went on. The markets reopened, the canals flowed, and the towers still caught the sun. But something vital had been lost, the invisible thread that tied the city to its own soul. Babylon, for all its splendor, had become a symbol of its own demise. Even its conqueror, Cyrus, knew this. He had not destroyed the city, yet in taking it, he had ended it. Greatness cannot survive without belief, and Babylon's belief had already withered before his arrival. The years that followed turned the city into memory. The Persians made it a provincial capital, still rich, still respected, but no longer divine. The ziggurat of Marduk stood empty more often than not, its summit visited only by dust and silence. The once mighty processional way, where kings had walked and priests had sung, lay deserted beneath drifting sand. The gods of Babylon, those who had once watched so closely, seemed to sleep now, their temples hollow, their power forgotten. No fire, no fury, just silence. The kind that marks the end of a civilization. The Euphrates still flowed, but its waters no longer reflected the glory of Babylon's walls. Its people faded into history, its kings into legend, and its name into a whisper that haunted scripture and song alike. In the end, Babylon did not fall in battle. It simply forgot how to live. Under Persian rule, Babylon lived on, proud yet subdued, a reflection of its former self. Cyrus the Great had promised peace, and his successors kept that promise. The temples still rose above the plains, their altars filled with offerings, their priests still chanting the old hymns. The canals carried the same water that once nourished Hammurabi's fields, and the markets still echoed with the languages of traders from every corner of the world. Yet something had changed, something invisible but undeniable. The spirit of Babylon, that fierce belief in its own divinity, had dimmed. The city was alive, but it no longer dreamed. Generations passed, and empires shifted like the desert sands. The Persians were followed by new conquerors, each taking Babylon as a prize, each leaving their mark upon its stones. Then, in 331 BC, the world changed again. From the west came Alexander the Great, a young Macedonian king with eyes set upon eternity. When he entered Babylon, there was no war, no resistance. The gates opened to him as they had once opened for Cyrus. He was hailed as the new king of kings, the master of Asia, and he too saw in Babylon more than a city. To Alexander it was destiny itself. He stood among its ruins and vowed to restore it. He ordered the reconstruction of Marduk's great temple, the Asargala, and commanded his architects to rebuild the city into the capital of his vast empire. Babylon would once again become the centre of the world, a bridge between east and west, earth and heaven. But fate had other plans. Before the dream could take form, Alexander fell ill within the city's walls. Some said it was poison, others the will of the gods. He died there, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, surrounded by generals and silence. The empire he had carved with blood and vision fractured overnight. His body was carried away, but his dream of rebuilding Babylon died with him. After Alexander's death, Babylon began its slow descent into forgetting. The Seleucid kings who followed chose new capitals, cities built on fresh ground, away from the weight of ancient stones. Babylon's temples emptied, its priests scattered, its canals dried. The great ziggurat crumbled stone by stone until only its shadow remained beneath the sun. Travellers who passed through spoke of a ghost city, walls half buried, towers split and silent, streets filled with dust instead of prayer. By the time Rome rose in the west, Babylon was no longer a city, but a memory. Greek and Roman writers described it with awe and sorrow, a place once filled with gods now haunted by jackals and wind. The rivers that had once made it flourish shifted their course, leaving its foundations dry and cracked. And when the Arabs came centuries later, they found only mounds of clay and the faint echo of a name that had once commanded the world. Yet Babylon never truly vanished. Its spirit lived on in the stories, in the scriptures, in the warnings carved into human faith. The Tower of Babel became a symbol of human pride, of our endless reach toward heaven and the punishment that follows. The whore of Babylon stood as a vision of decadence and doom, yet behind those tales lay the shadow of a real city, one that had dared to dream beyond its age. Kings may fall, temples may crumble, but myths endure. Today, the wind still moves softly over the plain where Babylon once stood. The earth there is pale and dry, scattered with broken bricks that once formed palaces and gates. Archaeologists brush the sand from tablets, reading words first written 4,000 years ago. Stories of trade, of law, of love and devotion. And somewhere, beneath layers of dust and time, the heart of the old city still beats faintly. For every empire that rises carries a little of Babylon within it, its ambition, its brilliance, and its tragedy. The gate of the gods stands no more, but its name still burns in scripture, in stone, in the human heart, a warning and a whisper from the city of sins. If you've stayed with us through Babylon's rise and fall, thank you. We tell these stories to remember, not to fear the past, but to understand our place within it. Like and subscribe for more journeys through the forgotten empires of history. And as you drift to sleep tonight, remember, even the greatest cities fade into dust.